Okay, so our second session today, quality management systems. And this is the second part of that kind of compliance puzzle for MedTech companies, right? The first is your pre-market strategies and your regulatory submissions for your product. And the second piece to keep in mind are quality management systems. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Again, thank you so much to Launch Dayton, and thank you to the Entrepreneurs Center here, and we're very happy to be here at MedTech Startup Day. So again, I'm Alison Sathy, introduced myself last time, so I won't go into it, and our contact information is at the end of this slide presentation, so do feel free to reach out to us at any time. So today we're going to talk about quality management systems in MedTech, and specifically targeted towards startups. What are those right-sized quality management systems in MedTech, and what do you need to do for your company? Pardon me. So part of that is determining what quality management system elements are needed for your company. We're going to talk about the right time for design controls, because as startups, that's probably where most of you guys are in your process. And then how to implement a QMS with small and distributed teams, because these are some of the biggest challenges that MedTech startups face when they're looking at their quality management system. So we'll start at the basics. What is the QSR, right? Quality system regulation. And a lot of startups are really familiar with understanding that for their product, they're going to need to do some kind of submission to the FDA. I find that oftentimes they're less familiar with the QSR. This is another part of FDA's regulation. So it's in the Code of Federal Regulations. It's defined under 21 CFR Part 820. And it defines quality systems regulations that are applicable to finished device manufacturers. So it sounds like when you hear finished device manufacturers, it sounds like, oh great, that's not for me because I don't have a finished device yet. Obviously that's something you need to put into place well in advance, because part of it details the design, the development of your product, and the infrastructure that you need to support your product as you're doing those design and development activities. In 21 CFR 820, they talk about manufacturers being responsible for establishing the requirements for your device or device types, right? And we'll get into some of the specific documentation that FDA looks for as evidence for that, but demonstrating that the results of the devices result in a product that's safe and effective. So basically, how do you ensure quality in your product and bake that into your product and processes? Establishing methods and procedures to design, produce, and distribute these products so that they meet the quality management systems requirements. What's the objective evidence for that? So in that case, we're saying documentation, right? Where's your documentation? That's what FDA is going to look for in their audits. And I have this in bold here. They say responsibility may not be delegated. So ultimately, the manufacturer, even if you're not manufacturing, so if you have a contract manufacturer, you're still a legal manufacturer of the device, your company name is on that product, you are responsible for the quality. Now, you might delegate some of these activities in manufacturing or in design and development, and they're fantastic partners. I know some of you guys are working with fantastic partners to do some of those activities, but the ultimate responsibility is yours. And that's something that a lot of startups aren't clear on, so that's why I kind of harp on it here, that it is really important to consider this. An exemption from a pre-market submission requirement doesn't necessarily mean you're exempt from GMPs, which is another way of saying kind of the quality system regulation, good manufacturing practices. They're used kind of interchangeably. But it doesn't mean that you're GMP exempt always. Sometimes it does, but there are always specific portions of the regulation that do apply whether you're a Class 1 exempt product or not. So FDA likes to talk about the flexibility of the QSR. FDA doesn't prescribe exactly how to produce a device. They will not tell you exactly what your sampling plan should be for inspection. They won't tell you what your purchasing and distribution procedures have to look like. What they will say is you do need to have those controls in place. So there is this flexibility of the QSR, and the QSR is really a framework from which to build your quality management system. And again, here's the manufacturer's responsibilities. We talked about them a little bit here. I put it in bold again because it's really important, right, to understand. how you need to qualify, some of your partners that you're working with, what documentation puts you in a good place to make sure that you still are responsible in holding on to that authority appropriately. When we talk about quality systems regulation and 21 CFR 820, you will also often hear 13485. ISO 13485 is the international standard for medical device quality management system regulation. Technically, you do not have to comply with ISO 13485 if you are only distributing a device in the US. In reality, it overlaps greatly with the QSR. So sometimes people, especially outside of kind of quality and regulatory, use those interchangeably. You might find your investors or people doing due diligence speaking about both of those interchangeably. But technically, you don't have to have an ISO 13485 certificate if you're only working in the United States. In many international jurisdictions, you do need to get that ISO 13485 certification. And that's a process by which a certifying body comes in, they examine your quality management system, they examine your records, they do audits every year, and they issue you a certificate that says your quality management system meets the requirements of the standard. Back in May 2018, and well before this, FDA was talking about harmonization to 13485. Again, they overlap greatly. So it's very easy if you have a quality management system where you put into place compliance to 820, very easy to demonstrate compliance to 13485 and vice versa. They haven't done this yet, and then COVID came along in 2020. It's like FDA was completely overwhelmed. So we're all still waiting to hear what FDA is going to be doing with this harmonization. But again, that's not really clear yet. Like we said, there's lots of similarities here, right? So both identify all of these types of activities, right? Training, purchasing, DMRs, production and process controls, labeling, packaging, receiving, incoming, all of these things, change management, non-conforming material, CAPA, management responsibility. Both the QSR and 13485 speak to those activities in a little bit different language, but in general, a lot of overlap. Interestingly, ISO 13485 doesn't specifically speak to risk. That is a different standard that you'll want to become familiar with. That's ISO 14971, and that's the risk management standard for medical devices. However, 13485 does come from a risk-based framework. So both in the QSR and in ISO, you want to tailor the agency, the FDA and your certifying bodies will anticipate or expect that your system is tailored to the level of risk for your product. If you have a Class 1 exempt device, and that's all you're manufacturing, and you have a contract manufacturer manufacturing it that you have good control over, and your records are great and all of those things, that quality management system looks a lot different than somebody who's developing and distributing a cardiac implant, right? The controls just look a lot different. And so again, that's where that flexibility of the QSR comes into place. And a lot of times we'll talk about right-sized QMS. And you really want to make sure that you do have a right-sized QMS for your products and your team, because a startup company shouldn't have a system that looks like, J&J with 5,000 employees at a site. They should look a lot different, although they both ensure quality appropriately. 13485 in general is a little bit more prescriptive when it talks about kind of some of the documentation and records and things like that. There's different inspections and audits. So again, when we're looking at ISO 13485, you would sign a contract with a certifying body. They would have a audit year 1, that is your certification audit. Year 2, they would have a surveillance audit. Year 3, they will have another surveillance audit. And then year 4, they'd have another recertification audit. So you're on that 3-year cycle with them when you're looking at ISO 13485. And then again, there's some different specific terminology that they like to use in different areas. I put in ISO 9001 because I do get asked about this somewhat regularly. It's not for medical devices. So if you're making a commercial product, 9001 would be a great standard. I think actually 9001 is a very good standard. Some medical device companies comply with both 9001 and 13485. 13485 is specific to MedTech. So, if you're going after compliance, I would suggest not meeting 9001, but really going straight to 13485. And again, it's generic. It's for commercial products as well as regulated products. And then MDSAP, the Medical Device Single Audit Program. Fantastic program. I love MDSAP. This is for multiple jurisdictions. So MDSAP might be something that you don't pursue right out of the gate, but something to keep in mind as you go internationally with your product. And what the MDSAP does is it allows one auditor to come in, or one team of auditors to come in, and audit you to multiple different international regulations. And on the next slide, we have MDSAP members. So MDSAP members include Australia, TGA, Anvisa in Brazil, Health Canada, NMPA, and, PMDA. NMPA is China. They do not actually recognize MDSAP. And the US Food and Drug Administration. So what you can do is actually on that ISO certificate, have those MDSAP, have your certifier list those MDSAP countries which they've inspected to. And of course, there'd be a different fee depending on the different jurisdictions that they audit you to. But the nice thing about that is instead of having to have Anvisa come in and Health Canada do their audit, it all gets done at one time. So that's really helpful. In addition, they will report your findings to the Food and Drug Administration. And in those cases, that is fantastic because then you can expect that unless you really have some kind of problem, unless there's a for-cause audit, which FDA does come in and audit for cause, but withstanding that, you probably won't see the agency showing up, and that's nice to just kind of know that your audit schedule is more, you can plan around it a little bit better. There are official observers and affiliate members right now. So these are countries that might be joining officially for MDSAP, and they are on the periphery. They do recognize the ISO 13485. So if you're going into the EU, again, the ISO 13485 standard, they will recognize that certification, and that can be on your MDSAP cert as well. So the first step in setting up your QMS is really determining your scope. What are you going to be doing, right? So what are the applicable regulations? What certifications do you need to support your regulatory strategy? Again, that's going just domestically versus international. What's the cost? And what kind of infrastructure do you need to support this? So again, a PMA device, if you're manufacturing it yourself in a clean room, distributing it yourself, all of these things, you're gonna need a lot more control and rigor around that than something that is more outsourced or a lower risk product. So thinking through all of these things and then really understanding what's the scope of my QMS? What do I need to put into place is a good thing to think about in advance. So again, one of these things is not just what are you going to be responsible for, because if you have a product that's non-exempt, you'll be responsible for compliance to the entire QSR, but also what responsibilities are you delegating versus what you're going to perform in-house? Again, I think nowadays it's pretty rare to see a company that does everything from design to manufacture, package, and distribution of finished goods under one roof. A lot more of these activities are outsourced, and that's great for entrepreneurs, right? Because you can contract with folks who are experts at what they do in terms of the design, the development, the manufacture, the sterilization, the packaging, all of those types of activities. You can outsource those. And we'll talk a little bit about if you do have those strategic partners, how do you still maintain that responsibility? And what does that documentation need to look like between the two partners to make sure that you still are comfortable with the compliance for your product? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is kind of an old graphic from FDA. What they're trying to kind of highlight in this graphic is management is in the middle, right? And that's one of the places they start. Management's always responsible, right? If you don't know something, you're responsible for not knowing that, and you'll still be held accountable. And so that's something that FDA likes to highlight, and you see, all of these systems flow back into management. Information flowing back to you is something that you need to make sure that you have in place, right? Oftentimes that's done with management review, Luckily with small companies, it's a lot easier to be very engaged with your quality management system and to really have a good understanding of exactly what's happening. You still need to perform that management review. And then they'll look at things like, actually, I can go to our next slide for this. They look into things under management, such as the allotment of resources, right? Do you have enough resources such that your quality system is robust enough to support the activities that you're performing at your company? Do you have a quality policy, quality objectives, management review? Is there strong involvement from management? And is there support in terms of funds and activities and infrastructure that management's putting into place around these systems? So for example, if you have a quality policy that says our commitment is to quality and we recognize these needs in our customers and all of these things, but then you have no quality management system to speak of and no quality representative to speak of, then they're going to say, okay, this manual's not enough. We need to see that infrastructure around it. These flow charts, you'll see a couple of these in the presentation. Those are from the FDA's companion document for audits, and it's just kind of an interesting thing to see how they look at the relationship between the actual 21 CFR 820, so you can see kind of these clauses right here, and how they go through in an audit and ask the questions of, how do we demonstrate compliance to these areas of the regulation. Quality audits. So we're going to go through and talk about some of these areas, again, of the quality management system, so you can get a sense for what are the activities that we need to perform under our system. Quality audits is a good place to start, not just because it comes at the top of that 21 CFR 820, but because this is a place where you're really checking your quality management system. Now, this doesn't mean you have to start doing quality audits when you're early in design and development controls. Oftentimes, these systems and aspects of your quality management system are phased in. That's why, like in our ClearMark solution that we have, which is an electronic quality management system online, we have modules so that you can kind of proceed to grow your quality management system as you proceed in your activities that you're doing under the umbrella of your company. And so as you kind of add some of these activities as you develop and grow, it's perfectly appropriate to add these procedures on as you're starting up. So for example, a startup company that is just prototyping their first product doesn't need a complaint handling procedure, right? You don't need to be doing CAPAs yet. All of that can wait. And so having that phased in approach and really kind of identifying that and putting that together in a simple quality plan can be a really good tool for organization and can give you as a founder a lot of confidence in kind of, okay, we're compliant. We know exactly when, maybe not the month and day, but at what phase we're going to integrate some of these policies, procedures, and activities. So quality audits, every manufacturer has to do them. You have internal quality audits, you have external supplier audits that we'll get to in kind of the purchase, that's under purchasing controls. But they need to be linked, and we oftentimes now think of quality systems as kind of a web, right? It's not just CAPAs and as standalone and audits as standalone. It all needs to be working together and coming again back to management, back to continuous growth of your quality management system and a continuous evolution to make sure that the quality of the products and services you're providing is appropriate. Audits can be very prescriptive. Basically, you're just checking, do we meet the regulations? Are our records correct? Are we following, are our procedures accurate? And do our records demonstrate that we're following our procedures? And that's what FDA is looking for when they come in and audit you as well. They'll come in and say, are their procedures sufficient for the activities that they're performing? Are they in compliance? And then do the records, which is the actual documentation that you're generating as you produce your product, as you do your activities in design and development, do those records demonstrate that they're doing what they said they were going to do? Personnel. So this is a big one, especially with startups. This is constantly a struggle. You might have a one-person team as you're starting your concept out, right? Obviously, that needs to grow in a way that's appropriate to your company. Now, if you have a class 1 product where you are going to be outsourcing a lot of those activities, You might continue to have a very small team, and that can be perfectly appropriate. What we want to do is just make sure that you document why that's appropriate in terms of those aspects of your quality management system. A great place to do this is your quality manual, where you describe those processes and flows within the company in terms of your compliance. Personnel has to be trained, so you have to have a training record. Usually I like to separate this into two files. One is kind of that qualifications record, so making sure it's the right person for the job, that they can do the activities that need to be done under the quality system, and then continuing to train them on your quality system and documenting those trainings for them. All that has to be maintained, and FDA will pull training records. We like to do this, make it really easy to audit, but they will go in and pull those training records, so you want to make sure that those are available for them. And then there's also the issue of effectiveness checks. How do you know that your training that you provided to your employees was appropriate? Do you have, if you're training someone on a work instruction in the manufacturing environment, is there a check that they've done these things correctly? Have you followed up with them? What does that look like? For procedures, it could be in the shape of a quiz or a form. It could be hands-on training, observational training, signed off by a supervisor. Lots of different forms and formats that those effectiveness checks that those look like. We're going to spend a couple minutes talking about design controls, because that's probably the focus of a lot of your activities if you're a startup and you're designing your first product, or second or fifth or whatever product. But design controls are really important. And I'm sure you guys have all seen this graphic. Like if you put in design controls into Google Images, it's like the first 18 images I think that you see. It's from FDA, a very old guidance document, but it still holds up, right? And it does a really nice job of talking through how do you cascade from your user needs all the way down to your validation, right? And so what we're looking for in the design control process is demonstrating that you've defined your user needs, you've defined your inputs, you've defined your outputs, you've performed verification, you've performed validation, and that you're performing the design reviews at the appropriate times. Some people have interpreted this infographic as a really rigid structure, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, right? So oftentimes a lot of these aspects are a little bit more agile. You could kind of have some overlap in some of the activities, right? And that's perfectly okay. But still, it's just kind of a good thing to keep in mind in terms of how do these kinds of activities relate to one another, and making sure that your design control process assures that the device meets the user needs, meets the intended uses, and meets the specified requirements. I will say also, just one note on this, when we're looking at software, this still holds. Like I think sometimes with software, the process looks a little bit different, but we still have to perform all of these activities. And oftentimes it goes faster and is much more iterative, right? So like you might have lots more verification testing on a certain unit or something of your software. But the process definitely still holds. And so it's just kind of a note that there's some special nuance to software, and I'm happy to discuss that if anyone has a software product that they're curious about. So design controls apply to all Class 2 and 3 medical devices. You have to demonstrate conformance with design controls. Some Class 1 products are exempt from design controls, but I added a couple notes. Like sometimes you have a Class 1 product that by labeling or indication, you might plan on in the future becoming a Class 2 product. Again, particularly with software, oftentimes we've got companies that might be in this kind of health or wellness space that plan on transitioning to being a medical product. And so making sure that you have some form or semblance of documentation for those products early in your design process is really, really helpful. Again, especially with software, and I'm sure if you have any kind of software questions, you can talk with Adam about that too, but the software piece is really interesting because we see a lot of developers coming from the commercial world into the regulated space, and the documentation does look a little bit different in those two spaces. So making sure that's really well understood, particularly if you have software as a medical device or a software-heavy platform. So when should you begin? This is the perennial question with startups: when do I start my design control process? Because in reality, you don't want to start it too early, because it is more prescriptive. It is, the documentation burden is heavier, and you don't want to start it when you're in concept. So when you are just figuring out your prototyping, what your user needs are, sourcing information from your clinicians from the field, that doesn't necessarily need to be a part of your design control activity. Design control should start after concept and before design. Now, that's kind of a silly way of putting it because there's a lot of overlap, right? But you kind of get the drift there, right? When you have an idea of the form and function of your device and you're starting to put specifications around that, the requirement specs, that's a good time to start thinking about design controls, because design controls will actually help you in your planning process, right? What design controls are doing is they're telling you and your team, here's exactly what we're going to generate and deliver at each phase of development of our product. And that can be incredibly clarifying and really helpful in terms of schedule. Prior to IDE, when you're planning to bring a device to market, again, all of these statements have a lot of wiggle room, right? But I put this last one in specifically. When you're planning on partnering to bring a device to market, and what I mean by that is lots of folks that we run into that are entrepreneurs might say, okay, we just want to do a 510K and then we're going to get acquired, right? We're never going to actually distribute our device, so we don't really need to do design controls. And you know, I totally understand where that statement is coming from, but I will say, anyone who's doing due diligence on your product is going to look at your documentation and they're going to look at your process and they're going to say, what do I need to do to remediate this to bring it under my design control umbrella, right? And there are always going to be things that need to be done. But if you have very little documentation and there needs to be a lot of remediation done to bring that product in-house, that might be a situation that could affect your valuation, that could affect those types of activities. And so I think just keeping this in mind, when you're looking at creating all of that documentation for your product, how is it going to be used even if you're not planning on bringing the device to market yourself? Even if you're not planning on standing in front of FDA in a inspection, what does that look like for other folks and how might that impact the value of your product and your company? Here's some of the aspects of design control, right? Design planning. Inputs, outputs, reviews, verification, validation, risk management, transfer, DHF, change control. So that's kind of the process all laid out. Obviously, there's a lot of changes to these documents, and this is not comprehensive of all the documents that are created during design controls. So the planning activities, obviously, that needs to be put forward in terms of documenting to the FDA that you're executing on the plan and generating the documentation that you said you were going to generate during your process. Design inputs, those are the physical and performance requirements of a device that are used as the basis for the design. And then the outputs are the results of the design effort. So that's basically your drawings, your DHF, your design of your product, that's your outputs. And the total finished design outputs consist of the device, the packaging, and the labeling. So basically, everything that goes into your DMR, your device master record, that's your outputs. And we'll talk about verification in a little bit. Design reviews. So design reviews have to be conducted at predetermined intervals, and they have to be documented. And you have to basically show that you have examined your device, the adequacy, if it's meeting the requirements, if you're following your plan, all of those activities, and identify any issues. And that is really a team function, right? The design review typically is not something that one person can sit in a room and do. You actually need experts from the various fields to weigh in on your product and process. So that would be folks like from management, from your R&D group, your engineers, from operations or manufacturing, clinicians, where you need clinical input, particularly when you're looking at like risk management documents, you want to have that expertise available. Marketing usually is good in design reviews, so they can kind of assess impact and of the product and marketability of the product. All of those functions you're going to want to see represented in your design reviews. And you also do need an independent reviewer, someone outside of your team. Could be somebody in-house but not working on the project, or it could be somebody completely independent that needs to be at that design review as well. And typically those are conducted after kind of the main phases of work. So those design reviews aren't that weekly project meeting that you have. Typically those are conducted kind of at the end of concept, so basically when you're ready to start your design controls and kick off your whole project, around the time where you've got your verification strategy in place, when you've got your validation strategy in place, and then design transfer. And that's that transfer from kind of the engineering into, you know, just full-on manufacturing and distribution. We'll talk about the DHF in a little bit as well. Change control obviously is incredibly important. And we can talk a little bit about when you're going to lock your device, right? Because that's when change control sets in. And that's typically around the time you're doing testing, right? If you do some verification tests and then you change some parameters of your device, you have to repeat that verification testing. So making sure that you have change control in place and your design is locked at a certain point in your development is really important. We put in a slide on V&V because they are sometimes kind of used interchangeably, but they're different animals, right? So the verification is, does the output meet the input? And typically what we're looking at here are things like, does it meet the spec? If there is a durometer or hardness of a certain component that needs to be above some parameter, you can check that. Your biocompatibility, your mechanical testing of a component or a part, all of those things are kind of verification activities. Obviously, all that needs to be documented in the DHF. Validation is really, does the product meet the user's needs? And so those are things like simulated use testing, animal studies, software validation. Those types of activities are done under validation, typically coming a little bit later in the process. Clinical studies, I don't know if I said that, also under design V&V. So one of the kind of, again, when we kind of look at this as a web, we think about, okay, so how do we know that design controls are being conducted appropriately, right? And when we're looking at audits, how do we audit ourselves? How does the FDA audit us? It's the documents, right? I am sure you've heard if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? So it's all about document control. And I will say this is something that goes from being very manageable in the beginning. You've got your file folders, they're on Dropbox, everything's organized, and then all of a sudden you have 500 documents and you don't know which revision is what, and it can get really overwhelming really, really quickly. Particularly if you haven't set forth a design control procedure and made sure that the tools you're using are appropriate to the task. So, for example, a lot of startups start out with paper, and that's perfectly appropriate and compliant. I will say if you're using Dropbox or Box.com or something like that that's not validated and Part 11 compliant, you're using paper. You just have a shadow system that's kind of doing your electronic copies. And that can be okay. And again, particularly in the beginning when you're figuring out what your process is. But you definitely want to put in parameters around the document control and the control of documents as you kind of begin down your design development pathway and start adding elements of your quality system. Because again, this is how FDA audits you, and this is how you audit yourselves, and this is where all of your due diligence comes from, right? And a good doc control system can save you so much time and money because you are much more efficient. Your consultants are more efficient. The people who are working with you are much more efficient. And so really thinking about kind of what should this look like for my company is really important up front. And that might change, right? You might, again, start out with a paper system, move to an electronic system, and that's perfectly appropriate. It's just definitely something that you want to kind of think about because it is the foundation of your quality management system. Something also to think about, signature authority, right? So who has to sign off on what and how do you control that? If I'm a test engineer and I am generating some verification testing, who has to sign off on my test protocol and report, right? quality should probably sign off. Probably, if you're the entrepreneur, you want management yourselves to sign off on that as well, right? So setting up that signature authority and making sure that that's followed appropriately is really important. Typically, we'll see this in the form of kind of a designation of who gets to sign what and some control of that. And there's various ways to exert control over that, right? Like in a paper system, that would be done via training to make sure that everybody's trained. That would be done via quality systems checks to make sure your document control administrator checks that those things were signed off appropriately as a hard copy. And then in electronic systems, those are all done automatically, right? So you might not need that document control administrator to take over that piece. Document approval, so we talked about signature authority a little bit. We talked about hard copies versus e-copies, and again, kind of starting out and making sure that you're really comfortable with the system that you're using. Document distribution. So FDA basically says documents also have to be made available to the people that need them, right? So do you have those readily available to, your teams as needed, particularly when you're looking at kind of like manufacturing and production and things like that? Those are particular areas where you might have people that, are doing operational or procedural work that need to be trained, and then you need to make sure that they have access to those documents. Obsolete documents must be removed and not be used, so you have to make sure you've got control over that piece. And then, of course, we talked about document changes. So document changes, when we're looking at change controls, we want to make sure not just are we signing off, right? So if Adam generates a change order and he's basically going to do an initial release of an SOP and then he's going to update another SOP, and we both need to sign it. I can't just sign that and say, okay, here's Rev A and here's Rev B. We need to document what are those changes that occurred from Rev A to Rev B. Why is this initial release being released, right? What purpose does it serve? We need to document, is this change going to impact our product? Does it impact our regulatory registration? Does it impact our quality management system? All of those impacts need to be assessed. And so finding a good way to do that is super important. Again, our system, electronic systems, some do this in an automated way with like a workflow. If you're not doing that, if you're doing that in a paper system, making sure that you have a separate change order form that documents all these activities and impacts, super important to record. And then changes must be communicated. So if you're updating a work instruction for assembling a product and don't do training on that updated work instruction, that's going to be a compliance issue, right? So making sure that you're training people appropriately as these changes occur is super important as well. So that's a little bit about design control and document control. We'll talk here a little bit about purchasing controls because this is definitely something that will be very important to startups because typically you're outsourcing activities. Pardon me. Okay, so what you want to do is provide quality products beyond what can be achieved in inspection and testing, right? So basically they're saying, how are we certifying that our suppliers, that our contractors, that our consultants have the capability to provide the quality that we need? So for example, if you're hiring a design firm and at the end of the day, you want to get from this design firm an entire design history file, right? You want it to be turnkey. At the end of the day, you want them to give you the whole DHF. You have to make sure that you inspect them for things like, do they have a quality system where they can actually generate a DHF, right? Do they have a procedure that says, we know how to generate DHFs and here's how we do it? Do they have the capability? Do they have the resources? Do they have the budget? Does our statement of work reflect that? All of those things need to be done through supplier qualification and management. So there's two pieces. One is that qualification piece. That's done based on risk. And I'm looking if this is my next. See, get right into it. So you should have a risk-based approach to supplier management. So if you're looking at somebody who is providing a marketing brochure to you, that risk looks a lot different than somebody who's your contract manufacturer, right? And they should be evaluated differently. So approaching your suppliers in a risk-based framework is perfectly acceptable. You don't need to vet that marketing brochure provider as much as you need to vet that contract manufacturer. So coming at the supplier qualification from a risk-based framework is really important. You should have a procedure that talks through that and a specific workflow or documentation to show that supplier qualification is done appropriately, and that becomes part of your supplier file, right? When you're looking at risk, looking at the product and supplier based on your product is important. And again, this goes to if you're making a Class 1 exempt device versus a Class 3 product, your controls look a little different around that as well. Same supplier might have different risk for different things that they're providing. You should always classify them according to their highest risk. And you should always maintain on your approved vendor list or the AVL or ASL, whatever you want to call it, that is appropriate, right? So basically what we're checking for is, are you purchasing things appropriately from them? If you haven't audited this supplier and they're providing you finished sterile product, there's probably a mismatch there. And so that's a piece where looking at your supplier qualification saying, okay, for this type of supplier, what do I need to do? It's really important. Typically we see things like you need to do an audit for high-risk suppliers to make sure they have the quality system and infrastructure to provide the goods or services that you're looking for. You need to have them fill out, some general information, collect their certificates, things like that. Another big thing is quality agreements, and this will really protect you, the entrepreneur, in terms of your design, development, and distribution, manufacturing, distribution of product. The quality agreement is so important because that actually speaks to the elements of the quality system that are being taken care of under your supplier versus your umbrella. And they can get really complex, as you can imagine, right? If you're looking at supplying final finished goods that are sterile, those can get really complex. Those should talk about the things like communication. How does communication flow from you to the supplier and back? What are they obligated to inform you of? At a minimum, they need to be obligated to not make a change to your product or process until you approve that, right? But there's all sorts of other things. Where is the device master record going to be located? Do they have to send that to you or a shipping warehouse, or is it retained on file? What kind of access do you have to them and their facilities? All of these things can be discussed in a quality agreement, which is very standard. And so I definitely recommend putting that into place with any of your key suppliers. And if you guys want a template for that, email me and I will send one to you, because it's just so important that you put those into place. Identification and traceability. Some of these things we'll just kind of buzz through really quickly because they're kind of more toward the end of your process, right? Obviously, you need identification and traceability of your product from receipt of components all the way through finished goods, right? And that's really important because if you have a problem with one of your components, let's say the manufacturer of component X calls you and said, oh, we had a problem with that component and it's only half as strong as we thought it was going to be, and we're sorry. And that's an essential performance part of your product, and that's gone out to the field. You need to know which products that's in so that you can pull those back from the field if you've done a health hazard evaluation and that's what needs to be done. So full traceability, records of every material from incoming to going out in a finished good needs to be recorded. And actually, also product that's disposed of, labels that are disposed of, labels that are placed on product. All of those things need full traceability and material controls. And if you're looking at CMOs, again, looking at these types of activities, so being familiar enough with these processes so that you know what to look for. So you might not need to be an expert in this, but you need to know that they're an expert in it and that they do some of these functions is super important when you're looking for a partner. Production and process controls, right? So production and process risk analysis, when you're looking at controls for process, part of it happens in your development process, right? So part of that is that process validation when you're getting your line up and running. And then part of that is the control on the back end of, okay, we're continuing to run these parts and manufacture these devices. how do we know that we're continuing to meet the quality standard that we're supposed to meet? So making sure that you have processes in place and that those are being followed, that they're all appropriate in terms of your inspections being based on risk and all of those things, incredibly important. You know, when we talk about risk too, primarily, at least my bias is when I think about risk, I think about clinical risk, right? You've got a product, it's in the clinical or home use environment where it's going to be used at the point of care, and what does that risk look like? Absolutely, that's one thing that we need to address in risk management. We also need to look at design risk. Usually, I like to use FMEAs, but you can use lots of other tools, but like a design FMEA, and then a process FMEA, right? So what risks can your processes in production introduce to make sure that you have a comprehensive view of your risk management, and that all goes into your risk management file. So definitely looking at process and production controls there as well. Non-conforming product, or NCRs, you're gonna have them, right? Or your manufacturer's gonna have them. How do they handle them, right? What's an acceptable scrap rate? What happens when they get non-conforming product? You know, what's the root cause investigation look like? How does that get dispositioned? All of those things need to be addressed. And a lot of times, again, we talk about kind of that web. This will flow into CAPAs, corrective actions, preventative actions, right? If you kind of see that you're consistently getting a bad connection at a joint that you're trying to, you know, press together or something, what does that process look like? What are you doing with that non-conforming part? And is that risk and root cause assessment being kind of carried all the way through to becoming a corrective action? NCRs are really important because, again, that gives you an opportunity to grow where you're looking at kind of your continuous improvement of your quality management system and also your product. And of course, that leads us to CAPAs, corrective and preventative actions. So CAPAs, again, probably not something you're going to start off the bat with, but definitely are an important part of your QMS. And that's something where you're going to be looking at both for your product, your processes, and your quality management system infrastructure, where do I need to perform corrective actions where I'm seeing something go wrong? And where do I need to put into place preventative actions to prevent an issue that we see that might become an issue? And so CAPAs a lot of times come from various streams within your quality management system. Might come from complaints, right? You're getting complaints from the field that your sterile packaging has, you know, a crushed corner. That's a big deal, right? A potentially non-sterile package. That's a great opportunity to say, we have to open a CAPA and see what this is, perform a root cause investigation, and really dig into this issue. So it might come from complaints, might come from your audits. You notice a non-conformance in your audit that, you know, your whole team is consistently filling out this one form wrong, and you're seeing this mistake every time. What is the corrective action for that? Maybe you need to change the form, maybe you need to retrain your team. All that's done under this great umbrella of CAPAs where you can record that, record any impact that comes from your action, right? So if you made a correction, is that correction introducing new risk? You need to assess that, document that in your CAPA, and then making sure that you check the effectiveness of the action that you took. So that might be a longer term activity, right? Where you're saying, okay, we made this correction to this form. Now we're going to monitor over the next 10 weeks how this form is getting filled out and make sure that we've mitigated that issue that we were seeing. And then you close out your CAPA. CAPAs need to be communicated to the appropriate people. So usually this includes management for management review. Oftentimes in management review, you're analyzing all these different aspects of your quality system. And as you get to the more mature quality models, you're doing things like tracking, trending, data analysis to say, hey, are we responding appropriately? Is our quality system growing? Is it robust? Is it healthy? Are we doing all the things that we know we need to do? Labeling and package controls. Again, I won't get too much into this, but obviously you have to control your labeling, right? And this gets more complicated than it would seem. You do have unique device identification that needs to be updated if you make changes to devices. Specific changes sometimes needs to be updated. You do have to control your labels. You will have lot and product-specific information on those labels so that they can't get reused. So it does become a little bit trickier than it would seem on the face of things to control your labeling and packaging. Obviously, you need to make sure that the packaging that you're using is sufficient for the product that you are shipping in. That can oftentimes be part of your design verification and validation. And I will say more and more, as we're looking at labeling, that is becoming more and more of a human factors assessment. So like if you're looking at performing human factors engineering, usability assessments for your product, oftentimes now, labeling will come into that as a verification activity as well. So if you're doing kind of a labeling validation, where you're looking at, are users understanding our labeling? Can they follow the instructions? Can they identify the information that's in there? That's a part of these activities as well. Acceptance activities, handling, storage, distribution, and installation. I like how we crammed all of these into one slide. So this is one that we are also going to kind of skip over a little bit because it's probably pretty early for the folks that are in this room, right? When you're thinking about concept, you're not necessarily thinking about distribution. I will say, obviously, you need control around all of these activities, right? One kind of funny story is we had a client that once came to us and they were distributing laser products from their living room. And we said, this is probably not going to work. Like this does not look like there's control around these activities. We need to do some remediation activities here. So obviously, all of these are things that you need to kind of understand. You can certainly see the difference between well-organized warehouses with appropriate controls and not. There's lots of distribution facilities now that just do this. So again, we see very small teams sometimes with fantastic quality where they're controlling a design and development team, a contract manufacturing team, and a contract distribution team, and that is perfectly appropriate. Just again, making sure that you know and are aware of these activities so that you can make sure that your partners are fulfilling these activities. Same thing with equipment and facility controls. Your equipment and facility controls procedures will look a lot different depending on what you do. Come on in, no problem. So making sure you have sufficient space, right? If you're performing design and development and your engineers don't have the appropriate equipment to do the tests, that's a problem. If they're working on test equipment that's not calibrated, if there's no control of the equipment, that's an issue, right? So making sure that all of your equipment, not just for production, but also in your development activities, that's really important to make sure that you have control over. And we see this in things like equipment logs and preventative maintenance schedules and all of those things. Again, pretty straightforward to implement, but knowing that those are needed is very important. And then records. So we talked a little bit about the difference between your procedures and your records. Again, this is where FDA looks a lot at how do we know you're doing what you said you were going to do? How do we know that the product meets the requirements for safety and effectiveness? How do we know that the inputs match the outputs? And so all of these things are demonstrated in your records, and those are kind of the forms, the documentation, all of those things that are generated in your design control process and in your manufacturing process, in your quality system, to show that this has all been performed in accordance with your procedures. You do have to maintain those for specific durations. In Europe, it's much longer than the EU. In reality, it's indefinitely. You want to maintain your documents indefinitely, right? And that's when we talk about like paper versus electronic systems, when to implement electronic versus paper. That's definitely a decision to be thought through, because paper can work really well in the beginning, but again, then you've got paper, right? And so thinking about when's the right time to put an electronic system into place. What is that going to look like? How is that going to serve you? What resources do you need around that electronic system? Is it relatively straightforward? Or do you have to have like a full-time tenant administrator that goes away to training to implement the system? All those are things to think about. Most companies now are in some kind of electronic system, right? So if you look at mature medical device companies, If they're a larger company, they've got kind of these enterprise systems. Mid-sized companies, smaller companies kind of use more platform systems, all perfectly appropriate. But do keep in mind they have to be Part 11 compliant. So like the records have to be compliant for the electronic signatures requirements from FDA and other security aspects of the system. And records, just keep in mind, they do require proper signature authority, right? So whether you have a paper system or an electronic system, designating that system or that signature authority is very important to make sure that that's clear. And then this is the part that is a little bit, I think, more applicable to right now for folks. And these are pertaining to my device. What are the records that FDA is going to come in and look at? They're going to look at your DHF. The design history file is the evidence that you complied with your design control procedures, right? So this is kind of all of the reference records in your design and development. It includes previous revisions of records, as well as kind of the records that you have now, right? So the DHF is looked at as kind of a snapshot in time where you're looking at was the product developed in accordance with design controls. Device master record. That's the compilation of records containing the procedures and specifications for a finished device. So that's things like your label, your drawings, your inspection documents. All of those documents go in to make up your device master record. Your DHR, your device history record, that's what's coming out of production. And so for a lot of you guys, that might be your CMO, your contract manufacturer might generate that DHR for you, and then you're responsible for keeping that on file in your company. So that's basically every device that was packaged and put forward for distribution, having that record there. And again, that's important for traceability so that you can kind of go back and see, again, that full life cycle of that device from all the components that went into it to all the inspections that took place, and then eventually having that traceability to where that product ended up in terms of, you know, what customer did it reach. And then complaint files. So we won't talk too much about complaint files because, again, that's probably pretty early for most of you guys, but just keep in mind that that is something, and that's actually for Class 1 products that are exempt. They are still required to maintain appropriate records and to maintain complaint files. So that's a place where no one is exempt, right? And so having a procedure for when you get a complaint in, how is that recorded? How is that analyzed? How is the risk assessment done on that? What's the root cause investigation? There are reportability requirements to FDA. So some events have to get reported to FDA within 10 days, some within 30 days, and you have to record how those decisions were made as well. So that's all a part of your complaint process and your complaint workflow. Servicing, we won't mention too much about this. Again, you know, in general, some products require servicing, some don't, but if you do, you have to have controls around that. So if you're making something like, you know, capital equipment that you need to go in and, you know, service that device, you need to maintain records of that. That all goes into the DHR as well, or gets connected with the DHR, so you can see exactly what happened with that product, and it is available in real time. Statistical techniques. So this is actually a really big one, and it's important for right now for a lot of you guys, because when you get into design verification and validation, you have to make sure that that's conducted with appropriate sample sizes. And this is a place where we see a lot of people struggle, especially if it's their first product they're developing. What should my sampling plan look like? What should my sample size look like? I love this little table down here on the left. I go to that all the time, right? So if you're dealing with attribute data, what does your sample size need to look like? And what are the reliability and confidence levels that you need for your product? That's based on your device risk. So if you have a very simple low-risk product, maybe 90 at 90 is sufficient, right? Maybe 90 at 85 is sufficient. You have to document that well, you can document it wherever you want, but I like to do that in kind of the quality plan to say what levels are appropriate, and then also reinforcing those in your protocols. So really, really important, because if you test 5 devices, you've got a disposable device, and you go to FDA and you say, I did design verification, and I tested 5 of these, and here's my data, they're going to say, thank you, where's the rest of the data. That's not enough, right? So you have to make sure your sample sizes are big enough when you're doing verification validation testing, and that might vary, so it is tailored to what you're doing, but making sure you have a process around that's super important. And then also with manufacturing, right? So if you've got nonconformities in manufacturing, what are the inspection techniques that you're using to identify nonconformities? Those will vary based on your product risk and process risk, but making sure that you have the right parameters in place and that you're defining those in advance. Again, very, very important. And I'm telling you, this will actually save you a ton of headaches going forward because it just takes the guesswork out of it. If you have a procedure and you say, here's how we're implementing statistical techniques, it takes away a lot of headaches. Okay, so kind of finishing up here. I know this was a lot of QMS this morning, so everybody hanging in there? Everybody good? I know, it's a lot of information and not as exciting maybe as the regulatory piece, I don't know. Okay, so your QMS should really serve your business, right? The whole goal of this is not compliance because the FDA is telling me to. It's to save you time and money, right? It is to save you time and money. And that's what a good quality management system does. Now, I will say a bad quality management system will cost you money and will take a lot of time. And that can be really tough. And so that's why really partnering with folks who, again, have this kind of right-sized mindset for your business, who are familiar with kind of startup companies, that's so important, and really taking the time to kind of think through this in advance, because your quality system is going to grow as you go from startup with 5 people to a company of 500. Your QMS is going to change and evolve, and it really should be in that Goldilocks zone. It should be in the Goldilocks zone, which is sufficient to ensure quality and robust enough for what you're doing, but not documentation upon documentation upon documentation that's not serving quality, right? That's not actually getting you anything. You want to make sure it's actually, you're getting bang for your buck out of it, right? Make sure it's saving you that time and money and ensuring quality. It should be customized to your needs. What functions are you performing versus what you're outsourcing? There's lots of ways to go about putting in place procedures. Make sure you need them, right? You might not need certain procedures either at this phase in your development or for what you're actually, the tasks you're performing, right? If you're outsourcing sterilization, you'll need to have a sterilization procedure that talks about the need for things like sterilization, validation, dose audits, reporting, all of those things. But you're not going to need a dosing map of the facility that says how to conduct a dose audit, right? That's something you can rely on your partners for. So making sure you know what you're performing in-house versus outsourcing, and that your quality system reflects that. Again, same thing with your specific team, right? Making sure that those functions are represented appropriately that you need, and then designing your QMS in such a way that you're efficiently utilizing all of your personnel. Again, QMS should evolve. And then accommodating domestic and international requirements. The auditors will call out specific language, so making sure that if you have to audit to both ISO 13485 and 21 CFR 820, you got to make sure both of those are listed in your audit record, right? So like making sure that you're referencing the right regulations, that you're referencing the right jurisdictions, super important. Again, that comes into play in your quality manual when you're looking at your roles and responsibilities, and then also the jurisdictions that you're entering into. And then considerations for implementing your QMS. Again, we talked a little bit about right time. Again, I feel like that's one of the most frequently asked questions. What's the right time for me to implement my quality management system? It should be done kind of between concept and research and design and development, right? So making sure that you kind of put that into place at the right time is key. As you're doing some of your research activities and looking at kind of your concept phase, just make sure you collect your documentations during that time, right? Like just making sure that you've got those records. So if you're doing early animal studies, cadaver work, verification, prototype work, definitely record those activities to make sure that you have them available. But then when you get into design controls, having that more robust structure around it is super important. Again, starting early in the product life cycle is great, right? It can save you time and money in the long run. So again, we kind of think about that Goldilocks zone. You don't need to start it too early, right? If you're just in concept and you're going to be there for another 6 months, wait that 6 months. You don't need it yet. But you don't want to have the total device designed, done, and think you're in validation when you haven't done any recording of your requirement specifications. That's a little bit of a mismatch on the other side, right? Because then you'll be spending time to remediate your documentation to create a DHF, which you've kind of already done. So definitely trying to kind of think about it early so that you can put it in a place at the right time is important. Implementing, again, that phased-in approach. I love quality plans. I just love them because they make everything really clear to everybody. There's no confusion. Everybody in the company understands what we're going to do. I love using a quality plan for the implementation of your QMS because it's perfectly appropriate to say, at this phase, we're going to have document control, training, change control, risk management, and that's it as we start these activities. And then, when we get into XYZ activity, we're going to add on these other procedures. Perfectly appropriate to do. And I think that can give you just a lot of confidence moving forward that you're compliant with the regulation. And then just utilizing the right partners, right? I have seen this with startups. Obviously you guys are here, you're getting all of the information that you need to get. Making sure that you're really well informed when you're making decisions about partnerships is so key. We have seen folks that have said, we thought we were getting design and development from this firm, and what we ended up with was a prototype, right? They didn't understand going in that they weren't contracting with them to get a full DHF, and then they're very disappointed kind of on the back end because they didn't get what they thought they were going to get. So I love using quality agreements, again, to really well define those activities. That can be in addition to your business agreement, like in addition to your contract, or it can all be in one thing. That's okay too. But definitely utilize those where you need to, and just make sure you're really comfortable with your partners and what they're providing in their quality management systems. And really, here, utilize your quality, your supplier qualification SOP, right? If you've got a procedure in place where you're vetting suppliers, contractors, consultants, then that's great. You'll end up with the right people. Again, resources, if you need to contact us, reach out to us at any time. We love talking with startups. They're obviously usually really fun projects because they're moving really quickly, have really dynamic teams. So we always like to work with startups. Here's some great resources from the FDA where you can do CDRH Learn. I mentioned this in the last presentation. They have some great production process QMS stuff on there. I do highly recommend that you take a look at those. Good presentations there. And I know we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has any. That was a lot of QMS information. So, yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of formwork and paperwork that we want to do a system like this. Is this largely template-based? Do you have something put together that it's not starting from scratch? Is thinking from a startup perspective?
Yes.
Someone's going into this and trying to do this by themselves.
Very good question.
Trying to manage research and development and prototyping and contacting clients, and it's just this could be up by your holding something. It sounds like.
Oh yeah, easily. Yeah. No, absolutely. So this is such a good question because that's where startups are, right? You're a founder, you're trying to do everything yourself. You recognize this needs to be done, but how do you do it in an efficient way? And I will say there's lots of providers out there, which is why I say get really comfortable with the partnerships that you're making, right? So there's different ways to approach it. Some companies will sell SOPs. So they might say, okay, for X amount of dollars, you can just have these blank SOPs that we'll send to you, and they're paper, and they're for a paper system. And that's one thing. Some companies will sell tailored SOPs, where they'll say, okay, we'll consult with you, and it's kind of like our baseline SOPs, and then we'll consult with you, and we'll tailor them to your kind of company. And then there's platforms. And a lot of those electronic platforms are workflows that provide records in the system and allow you to electronically manage your documents as well. And that takes care of some activities. Now, the main point we saw, and actually one of the reasons we started Clearmark, is we saw startups using some of these platforms and they thought they were compliant. They're like, well, I use this. And it's like, you don't have any procedures that are detailing how you use that, right? What are you putting into it? Because that's part of the compliance. So like with our system, we provide all the SOPs, all the forms, and the workflows. And it's like you can use them all together, you can make your own, but you can use any of those I mentioned in a totally compliant manner. Just know what you're getting, right? So like if you get kind of, again, at that baseline level, like if you just buy a set of standard operating procedures that are just those, and then they automatically send you the PDFs, that's perfectly okay. You might be able to use those in a perfectly compliant way. That's gonna take a lot more time to get those, and to implement those than something like an electronic platform. So again, just kind of knowing what those compliance requirements are and then knowing, how to implement those. You can do it in a compliant way in a lot of different ways, but you just kind of have to understand what's the burden on, me as the founder, us as our small team, what does that look like for us? And I think too, when you're looking at electronic platforms too, choosing the right size platform. So like some platforms, you need to have a full-time document control administrator that you send away for a 2-week training that then, is a full-time position, whereas some are more turnkey. So really understanding kind of what those requirements are to support those platforms is helpful as well. Yeah, and just like, like as a startup, you wouldn't go and say, hey, I need an enterprise system that's completely custom to like what we're doing, right? It's just making sure you find that right-sized fit. But yeah, there's tons of tools out there, tons of tools. And yep, yeah, and that's one of the things we provide is like the entire kind of with the workflows as well as the standard operating procedures. Again, there's lots of different ways to do it. Happy to talk to you about any of those different aspects. I think again, just kind of knowing how that's going to fit in with your infrastructure is really important to understand. Yeah, but lots of tools, and honestly, a lot of great free resources as well. Like, I think if you just Google, like, design control procedures, it won't give you probably some very good ones, but you can kind of get a sense for like what's out there and like forms and formats, and there are some that are publicly available. So, definitely do try to leverage those resources. And you're in a great place for that here as well. So like if you look at kind of a lot of the partnerships around here where you've got like Launch Dayton, the Entrepreneur Center, all of these folks are like so happy to help and point entrepreneurs in the right direction and kind of give them guidance and things like that. Definitely leverage your network to get the information that you need. Yeah. Yes, so we work with the Entrepreneur Center, quite frequently. And so yeah, absolutely, they're fantastic. They do a lot of great things for founders, and we work with them frequently. Anything else? Well, thank you all for your time today. And we'll be here intermittently throughout the rest of the day, so definitely do come up and say hello, and we'll look forward to speaking with you.